Glorious evening. How is everyone? Thank you for joining me for Story Time with Venus. Welcome to episode 3. Thought we'd change it up here a little bit, go a little off course, try some classic novels. How about a little H.G. Wells? I picked out something special for us. I think you'll like this. H.G. Wells, Men Like Gods. What do you think? Shall we travel? And the Dream. Although I think we're just going to read the first chapter of Men Like Gods. We'll see. Maybe we'll feel adventurous. Book the first. The Interruption of the Earthlings. Ooh, looks interesting. Have I interrupted you, Earthlings? Chapter the first. Mr. Barnstaple takes a holiday. Mr. Barnstaple found himself in an urgent need for a holiday, and he had no one to go with and nowhere to go. We have all been there, Mr. Barnstaple. He was overworked and he was tired of home. He was a man of strong natural affections. He loved his family extremely, so that he knew it by his heart. And when he was in these jaded moods of it bored him actually. God bless him. His 3 sons, who were all growing up, seemed to get leggier, larger every day, don't they, though? They sat down in the chairs he was just going to sit down in. They played him off his own pianola. They filled the house with vast laughter at jokes that he couldn't demand to be told. They cut in on the elderly harmless flirtations that he had hitherto been one of his chief considerations in his vale. They beat him at tennis. They fought playfully on the landings, and fell downstairs by 2s and 3s with enormous racket. Children, aren't they a hoot? Their hats were elsewhere. They were late for breakfast. They went to bed every night in a storm of uproar. Ha, 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 bump! And their mother seemed to like it. Isn't that the way, though? They all cost money, with a cheerful disregard of the fact that everything had gone up except Mr. Barnstaple's earning power. And when he said a few plain truths, boy, Mr. Barnstaple, I absolutely am feeling you. It's tough life. Men Like Gods, H.G. Wells. Shall we read on? About Mr. Lloyd George at meal times, or made the slightest attempt to raise the tone of the table above the level of silliest persiflage, their attention wandered obstinately. At any rate, it seemed obstinately. I don't think that's necessarily the right word, but we're going to go with it. He wanted badly to get away from his family to some place where he could think of various members with quite pride and affection, otherwise not to be disturbed by them. And also he wanted to get away from a time before Mr. Peeve. The very streets were becoming a torment to him. He wanted never to see a newspaper or a newspaper place card again. Dear God, H.G. Wells, are you living in the 21st century? Shh. What's up with this? You need to listen. He was obsessed by the apprehensions of some sort of financial or economic smash that would make the Great War seem like a mere incidental catastrophe. This was because he was a sub-editor in General Factorium of The Liberal, that well-known origin of more depressing aspects of advanced thought, and the unvarying pessimism of Mr. Peeve, his chief, was infecting him more and more. Formerly, it had been possible to put up a sort of resistance to Mr. Peeve by joking fervently about his gloom with the other members of the staff, but now there were no other members of the staff. They had all been retrenched by Mr. Peeve in a mood of financial despondency. Particularly now, nobody wrote regularly for the Liberal except Mr. Barnstaple and Mr. Peeve. So Mr. Peeve had it all his own way with Mr. Barnstaple. He would sit hunched up in the editor's chair and his hands deep in his trouser pockets, taking a gloomy view of everything, sometimes 2 or 3 hours together. Dear God, I've so been Mr. Barnstaple, and it's atrocious, isn't it? Some people really. All right, back to Mr. Barnstaple's story. Thanks, Mr. H.G. Wells, on this fabulous moonlit Monday night. So, Mr. Barnstaple's natural tendency was towards a modest hopefulness and a brief belief in progress. But Mr. Peeve held very strongly that a belief in progress was at least 6 years out of date, and that the brightest hope that remained in liberalism was for a good day of judgment soon. Well, he sounds like a real fucker, doesn't he? Jeez. Oh, did I say that? It's story time with Venus, baby. Welcome to story time with me. I have fun with this, and we're gonna have some fun. So if you don't like it, sayonara. Otherwise, let's get back to H.G. Wells, baby. And having finished the copy of what the staff, when there was a staff, used to call his weekly indigest, Mr. Peeve would depart and leave Mr. Barnstaple to get the rest of the paper together for the next week. Even in ordinary times, Mr. Peeve would have been hard enough to live with, but the times were not ordinary. They were full of disagreeable occurrences that made his melancholy anticipations all too plausible. The great coal lockout had been going on for a month and seemed to foreshadow the chemical ruin of England. Every morning brought then he popped out and popped back in. Welcome to story time. Morning brought intelligence of fresh outrages from Ireland. Unforgivable and unforgettable outrages. A prolonged drought threatened the harvests of the world, and the League of Nations, of which Mr. Barnstaple had hoped enormous things in the great days of President Wilson, was a melancholy and self-satisfied futility. Everywhere there was a conflict, everywhere unreason. 7/8 of the world seemed to be sinking down towards chronic disorder and social dissolution, even without Mr. Peeve in it, and having been difficult enough to have made headway against the facts. Well, I bet all of you can relate to Mr. Barnstaple. Mr. Barnstaple was, indeed, ceasing to secrete hope. And for such types as he, hope is the essential solvent, without which there is no digesting life. Mr. Barnstaple, I think we were meant to be brought together tonight. Shall we read on, H.G.? Men like gods. Hope had always been in liberalism and generous liberal effort, but he was beginning to think that liberalism would never do anything more for ever than sit hunched up with its hands in its pockets, grumbling and peeving at the activities of professor, but more energetic men whose scrambling activities would inevitably wreck the world. Night and day now, Mr. Barnstaple was worrying about the world at large, by night even more than by day, for sleep was leaving him, and he was haunted by the dreadful craving of being out a number of the Liberal of his own, to alter it in to alter it all after Mr. Peeve had gone away, to cut out all the disruptive stuff and miserable empty grinding at this wrong and that, and the gloating on cruel and unhappy things, and the exaggeration of simple, natural, human misdeeds of Mr. Lloyd George, the appeals to Lord Grey, Lord Robert Cecil, Lord Lansomdown, and the Pope, Queen Anne, or the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. It varied from week to week, to arise and give voice and form to the young aspirations of the world reborn, and instead to fill the number with utopia. To say that the amazed readers of the Liberal, here are things that have to be done. Here are the things that are going to be done. Here are the things that we are going to do. What a blow it would be for Mr. Peeve at his Sunday breakfast. For once too astonished to secrete abnormally, he might even digest the meal. But this was the most foolish of dreaming. There were 3 young Barnstaples at home, and their need for a decent start in life to consider, and beautiful as the thing was as a dream, Mr. Barnstaple had a very unpleasant conviction that he was not really clever enough to pull such a thing off. He would make a mess of it somehow. One night, jumped from a frying pan into the fire. The Liberal was a dreary, discouraging, ungenerous paper, but anyhow, it was not a base and wicked paper. Still, if there was to be no such disastrous outbreak, it was imperative that Mr. Barnstaple should rest from Mr. Peeve for a time. Once or twice already he had contradicted him. A row might occur any when, and the first step towards resting from Mr. Peeve was evidently to see a doctor. So Mr. Barnstaple went to a doctor. "My nerves are getting out of control," said Mr. Barnstaple. I feel horribly I have no idea what this word is. It's a neurothenic, and you are suffering from northampia, said the doctor. I don't know. I dread my work daily. I dread daily my work. Thank you for staying with me through my big, long, giant pause. I dread my work. You want a holiday? You think I need a change? As complete a change as you can manage. Can you recommend any place where I could go? Where do you want to go? Nowhere definite. I thought you could recommend. Let some place attract you and go there. Do nothing to force your inclinations at the present time. Mr. Barnstaple paid the doctor the sum of 1 guinea, and armed with these instructions, prepared to break the news of his illness and his necessary absence to Mr. Peeve, wherever the occasion seemed ripe for doing so. For a time, the prospective holiday was merely a fresh addition to Mr. Barnstaple's already excessive burthen of worries. To decide to get away was find one's self face to face with once the 3 apparently enormous problems. How to get away? whither, and since Mr. Barnstaple was one of those people who tire very quickly in their own company, with whom? A sharp gleam of furtive scheming, crypt. Oh, that was the very first paragraph in chapter 2. So I'm going to leave you with that. I hope you had fun. Again, I shoot these completely uncut, completely just here in my studio. So if you like it, tune in. This was episode 3. We read Men Like Gods, chapter 1, and the first paragraph of chapter 2. So much fun. I love reading with you guys. I look forward to reading more. I have so much more in store for you.